The USB drive is still sitting in my top dresser drawer, inside a Ziploc freezer bag. I haven't taken it out since the day everything ended. I don't need to, but I keep it there because some mornings I wake up and for a split second I think maybe I imagined all of it. Then I see the bag, and I remember. My grandmother passed in November. Not suddenly. She'd been in palliative care at Sunnybrook for 6 weeks, and by the end it was a mercy. She was 81, stubborn until the last week, still asking the nurses whether they'd eaten lunch. That was her. Always feeding people, always worrying about everyone except herself. She had a house in Scarborough. Nothing fancy. A semi-detached on Kingston Road that she and my grandfather bought in 1974 for $38,000. My grandfather died in 2009, and after that, the house was just hers. She kept the garden the same way he did. She painted the front door the same red. She refused to put in a Ring doorbell because she said it was rude to record your neighbors without asking. I grew up going to that house every Sunday. My mother is her youngest daughter. My Aunt Diane is the oldest. I want to be fair when I talk about Diane. I've spent a long time trying to be fair. She worked hard. She raised 2 kids mostly on her own after her husband left in the late 90s. She took my grandmother to her medical appointments for years, which I know wasn't easy. Downtown traffic, limited parking, an elderly woman who second-guessed every doctor. I'm not pretending none of that happened. But Diane also has a way of keeping score that I've never seen anyone match. Every favor she did went into a ledger. Every Sunday dinner she hosted, every prescription she picked up, every time she sat in a waiting room at Toronto General. She remembered all of it, and she expected to be paid back. Not in gratitude. In real terms. My grandmother knew this. She told me once quietly in the kitchen while we were doing dishes. She said, "Your aunt loves me, but she loves what I have a little more." Then she handed me a bowl to dry and changed the subject to whether I was eating enough iron. She wasn't wrong. When my grandmother died, the family assumed the house would go to Diane. Diane assumed it too. She'd been the primary caregiver. She lived 20 minutes away. She had a daughter who could move in and help with the carrying costs. It made practical sense, and Diane had spent the last decade making sure everyone knew it made practical sense. What nobody knew except my grandmother, and eventually me, was that my grandmother had made other plans. 3 weeks before she died, she asked my mother to bring me to the hospital alone. Not my mother, just me. I remember being confused. I was 31 years old, working as a physiotherapist at a clinic in Leslieville. I wasn't the favorite. I wasn't the responsible one. I was just the granddaughter who called every week and showed up at the garden in May to help plant the tomatoes. My grandmother was propped up in the bed, smaller than I'd ever seen her. She had an IV in her left hand and the television was muted on a nature channel. She asked the nurse to give us 15 minutes. Then she reached into the drawer of her bedside table and handed me a USB drive. It was one of those old chunky ones, gray plastic, the kind you'd find at a Staples checkout in 2011. She pressed it into my palm and closed my fingers around it. She said, "Don't open it here. Don't open it with anyone in the room, when you're alone." I said, "Grandma, what is this?" She said, "It's what I want, and it's why." She squeezed my hand once. "Don't let Diane see it before you see a lawyer." I didn't open it that night. I put it in my coat pocket and drove home on the DVP with the radio off, and I sat in my parking garage for 10 minutes before I went upstairs. My partner, Marcus, was making dinner. I didn't tell him. I put the drive in my dresser drawer, and I went to eat pasta, and I didn't sleep until almost 3 in the morning. My grandmother died 8 days later, on a Tuesday, just after 6 in the evening. My mother called me, and I drove to the hospital, and by the time I arrived, they had already moved her. The room was empty and cleaned, and there was a different patient in the bed. That's the part nobody tells you about hospitals, how fast the room turns over. The funeral was at a Ukrainian Catholic church in Etobicoke. Her background, not something she practiced actively, but she'd wanted it written into her arrangements years ago. Diane organized most of it. She stood at the front and accepted condolences with the composure of someone who had already decided what happened next. At the reception afterward, in the church basement, Diane pulled me aside near the coffee urn. She was wearing a gray blazer and her hair was done, and she said, very quietly, "I'll need you and your mother to sign some things next week. For the estate. The house transfers are fairly straightforward, the lawyer just needs signatures from the other beneficiaries releasing any claim." I said, "I haven't seen the will yet." She said, "Of course. There'll be a reading. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page so it doesn't drag out." She smiled. "You know how these things can get complicated if people aren't cooperative." I said I understood. I did not say what I was thinking. That night I went home, and I opened the USB drive. There were 2 files. The first was a video. The second was a PDF. I watched the video first. My grandmother had filmed it herself, sitting at her kitchen table in Scarborough. The angle was slightly off. You could tell she propped her phone against something, maybe the fruit bowl. She was wearing her blue cardigan, the one with the small wooden buttons. The kitchen light was on. It was evening. She spoke for 22 minutes. She talked about the house. She talked about what she and my grandfather had intended for it. She talked about a decision she had made privately, with her estate lawyer at a firm in North York, after a specific incident that had happened in September of the previous year. She described the incident clearly. She had come home from a cardiology appointment to find Diane in her bedroom. Not just in her bedroom. At her desk. Looking through the filing cabinet where she kept her financial documents. When my grandmother asked what she was doing, Diane said she was looking for the extra key to the garden shed. "The filing cabinet," my grandmother said, directly into the camera, "does not contain keys. It contains only financial and legal documents." And Diane knew that. My grandmother said she wasn't angry, she said she was clear. She had already by that point amended her will. The PDF was the will itself, not the original, which was held by the lawyer, but a copy she had made for me, annotated in her handwriting in the margins. She'd left the house and its contents to me. Not to my mother, not split among grandchildren. To me, specifically, with a letter of explanation to the family that the lawyer held separately. She had also left a letter for Diane. She didn't tell me what was in it. I sat on my bathroom floor for a while after that. Marcus knocked once and I said I was fine and he didn't push, which is one of the things I love about him. Eventually I came out and I told him. I showed him the files. He watched the video and then he sat very quietly for a moment, and then he said, "You need to call a lawyer tomorrow morning, before you respond to anything from Diane." He was right. I called a lawyer the next morning, a woman named Claire who practiced wills and estates out of an office in Midtown. I sent her both files before the appointment and she had already reviewed them by the time I sat down across from her. She confirmed the will was valid. The amendment had been made 14 months before my grandmother's death, witnessed properly, filed with the court. There was nothing procedurally wrong with it. She also said that Diane might challenge it, that a disappointed beneficiary sometimes alleges undue influence, that I had somehow pressured my grandmother into changing her will in my favor. She said we should be prepared for that possibility. I asked what we could do. She said the video helped considerably. A person who films themselves explaining their own reasoning, calmly, clearly, months before their death, is not someone who appears to have been coerced. She said, "Your grandmother was very thorough." She was. She always was. The estate reading was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon at the lawyer's downtown office. My grandmother's lawyer, a man named Gerald who had handled her affairs for almost 20 years. Diane was there. Her daughter was there. My mother was there. And she was visibly nervous because I had told her the night before what was coming and she hadn't fully slept. Marcus drove me. He waited in the lobby, he brought a book and a coffee, and he kissed me on the cheek before I went up and said, "Whatever happens in there, you're not alone." I carried that sentence with me into the elevator. Gerald read the will. He was methodical and unhurried. He covered the RSP designations, the personal property, the bank accounts. My grandmother had modest savings, and she distributed those evenly among her grandchildren. He covered the car, which went to my mother. He covered the jewelry, itemized piece by piece. Then he got to the house. Diane was sitting across the boardroom table with her hands folded. Her daughter had a notepad out. They were both leaning slightly forward. The way people lean when they've been waiting for their name. Gerald read my name instead. The silence afterward lasted about 4 seconds. I counted, the way you count seconds during a thunderstorm. Then Diane said, "I'm sorry, could you read that again?" Gerald read it again. Diane turned to look at me. Her expression went through 3 or 4 things in quick succession. Confusion, recalculation, and then something harder. She said, "That's not right. I was her primary caregiver for 6 years. I was there every single week. You visited when it was convenient." I didn't say anything. She said, "I want to see the original document. I want to know when this was changed, and I want to know who was in the room." Gerald explained the timeline. He explained the witnesses. He explained that a separate letter from my grandmother, addressed to Diane personally, was included in the estate package, and he slid an envelope across the table. Diane didn't open it. She said she was ill, she wasn't thinking clearly, someone influenced her. She looked at me when she said it. My mother started to say something. I touched her arm once, and she stopped. I said, calmly, and I want to be honest, I had practiced this. I had said it to myself in the bathroom mirror the night before, because I knew this moment was coming. I said, "There's a video." She recorded herself explaining her decision. The date and timestamp are on the file. She made this choice 14 months before she died, when she was entirely well. Diane said, "I don't believe you." Gerald said, "I've seen the video, it's part of the estate file." The room went quiet again. Diane's daughter put down her pen. I think about what my grandmother must have felt, sitting at that kitchen table with her phone propped against the fruit bowl, recording herself. She wasn't dramatic about it. She wasn't performing. She was just a woman who knew her family well enough to know that the truth would need a witness, and she made sure there was one. Diane did retain a lawyer. For about 6 weeks I received periodic letters suggesting that the amendment should be contested. Claire handled all of it. The video made the undue influence argument very difficult to sustain. A court would have to argue that a woman who calmly and specifically described her own reasoning on camera, naming dates and incidents, had somehow been manipulated into doing so. The challenge was eventually withdrawn. I was told it happened quietly without any admission. The house transferred into my name in March. I went to Scarborough on the first Saturday after the transfer completed. I let myself in with the key I'd had since I was 19. The house smelled the same. That particular combination of the wood floors and whatever she used to clean the kitchen, something with lemon. The garden was still dormant. The front door was still red. I sat at her kitchen table for a long time. The fruit bowl was still there. I thought about the angle of the phone. I thought about her buttoning the blue cardigan before she pressed record. I haven't changed the front door. I don't plan to. I've thought a lot about what she was doing when she handed me that USB drive. She wasn't just giving me a house, she was giving me the proof I would need to keep it. She knew Diane would push back. She knew there would be a room with a boardroom table and cold water in a pitcher and someone leaning forward expecting their name. She prepared for all of it, quietly, without telling anyone. My mother and I still talk every week. She's adjusting. It was hard for her, watching her sister leave that meeting the way she did. The envelope unopened on the table. She picked it up, by the way. After Diane walked out, she picked up the envelope and held it for a moment, and then set it back down. I don't know what was in the letter. That was between my grandmother and Diane, and I've made peace with not knowing. Marcus and I spent one weekend last August fixing the back fence. He's not particularly handy. Neither am I. But we figured it out. The neighbors on the east side came over and introduced themselves. They said they'd known my grandmother for 18 years. They said she used to bring tomatoes over in August, more than she could use herself. I'm going to plant the garden the same way this spring. Same tomatoes, same spot along the south fence where the light is best. I don't know what I'm doing exactly. I'll probably look everything up, call my mother, make mistakes. But I have the time. And I have the red door. And in my dresser drawer, in a Ziploc freezer bag, I still have the gray USB drive. Some things you keep not because you need them anymore, but because they remind you that someone saw what was coming, and they trusted you to handle it. She was right too. I keep thinking about my grandmother at that kitchen table. Blue cardigan, phone propped against the fruit bowl, talking to a camera she was holding herself accountable to. Nobody asked her to do that. Nobody told her she needed to leave a record. She just knew, the way she always knew, that doing the right thing quietly wasn't enough. That integrity without evidence is only half a shield. That's the part I sit with the most, not the house. Not the house, Diane's face across the boardroom table. Not the envelope she left behind unopened. What stays with me is the image of a woman in her 80s, already ill, choosing to be thorough, choosing to be clear. Because she understood that the people who love you deserve the full truth, not just the version that's easiest to deliver. I used to think of honesty as passive. You just don't lie and that's enough. What she showed me is that honesty sometimes requires effort. It requires sitting down and saying the hard thing out loud, even when the room is empty, even when you're tired, even when part of you would rather just let it go and hope for the best. She didn't hope, she prepared. And because she prepared, I was able to walk into that lawyer's office and stand on something solid. Diane had worked hard. I've never stopped believing that. She had given years of her life to my grandmother's care, and she expected those years to be repaid in a specific way. I understand the logic. What she never understood, what I think genuinely confused her, was that my grandmother saw the difference between showing up and showing up with an agenda. You can do both at once, and the person you're caring for usually knows which one is true. That's not a judgment, it's just a consequence. The choices we make about how we treat people and why have a way of compounding over time. My grandmother noticed the filing cabinet. She noticed the way Diane held the future of the house in her mind like it was already settled, and she made a different decision, not out of cruelty, out of clarity. What I had to find, and it didn't come easily, I want to be honest about that, was the steadiness to not react when Diane looked across that table and implied I'd manipulated a dying woman. The steadiness to say one true sentence and then stop talking. Marcus always says, I have a tendency to over-explain when I'm nervous. He's right. But in that room, I just let the video do it. I let my grandmother speak for herself. And she did. I think that's what I'll carry forward from all of this. Not the property, not the victory of the will being upheld. The lesson is simpler and harder than any of that. It's that the way you move through the world, whether you deal honestly, whether you think carefully before you act, whether you hold on when things get difficult and resist the urge to fold, all of it accumulates. It becomes the story other people tell about you. It becomes the letter left in an envelope. It becomes 22 minutes on a USB drive that a woman you loved trusted you to find at the right moment. My grandmother was not a perfect person. She was practical and sometimes blunt, and she had opinions about things she had no business having opinions about. But she was decent, and she was thoughtful. And when the moment came that required her to be brave on behalf of someone she loved, she was. I planted tomatoes along the south fence last May. Most of them did all right.